The first time my in-laws hinted they wanted my house, they weren't even subtle. My father-in-law walked into my living room, tapped the wood trim with his finger, and said, "This place could sell for $750,000 easy. You ever think of cashing out?" That was the moment I realized they didn't see my home as mine. They saw it as a prize, and they were already rehearsing how they'd take it. My name is Daniel. I'm 50 years old. And this is how my in-laws tried to steal the only thing I truly built, and how I made sure they paid for every nail, every brick, and every dream they tried to take. Sit back and let me tell you how my own family tried to turn my $750,000 home into their fortune, and how I made sure the fortune slipped through their fingers and landed back in mine. Before we get too far, don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're listening from. They started small, offering suggestions like decorators flipping through a glossy catalog. "You know, Daniel, this kitchen could be twice as valuable if you opened up the wall." Or, "Look at this siding, 10 years out of style. Vinyl would really modernize it." I'd nod politely while inside I was taking mental notes. These weren't casual remarks, they were rehearsals. I could see the glint in my father-in-law's eyes each time he mentioned resale value. He wasn't admiring my home. He was calculating it, piece by piece, like an appraiser already holding the deed. My wife's mother was worse. She'd touched the doorknobs, the cabinets, even the stair railing, with a kind of proprietary pride, as if by running her hand across them long enough, they would become hers. One evening she sighed, "This house has such good bones. It deserves to be in the right hands." The right hands, of course, meant theirs. At first, my wife didn't see it, or maybe she didn't want to. To her, they were just enthusiastic parents with a habit of meddling. She believed their offer to pay for renovations was genuine generosity. She said things like, "It'll help us all in the long run. Don't be so suspicious." But suspicion was my only weapon. When they wrote the first check, $5,000 for roof repairs, I smiled and thanked them. They thought they'd gained ground. What they didn't realize was that I'd already started building a paper wall between us. I filed the receipt, photocopied the contractor's invoice, and stapled it into a folder marked with the date. By the time they funded the bathroom remodel, I had 3 folders. By the time they replaced the hardwood floors, I had 6. Each one thick with proof. Bank slips, text confirmations, even photos of them standing proudly beside contractors like proud new owners. They thought I was letting them in. In reality, I was documenting their fingerprints on every nail. Still, patience is hard. Some nights, I lay awake listening to my father-in-law's voice echo in my head. "When the time comes." That phrase burned like acid. He said it once, leaning back in his chair, smirking as though my house was already his inheritance. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles whitened, but I didn't speak. Not then. Not yet. The renovations dragged on for months. I watched as my home transformed under their money. The new windows gleamed. The tiles shone. The siding was pristine. They strutted through the halls as though they'd already moved in. I smiled, silent, the perfect grateful son-in-law. One night, my wife's mother patted my arm. "All this will be easier for you, Daniel, when you're older. You'll thank us for making it livable." I stared at her hand on my arm and thought, "You'll regret ever touching these walls." The day of small satisfaction came sooner than expected. I overheard them one Sunday, whispering in the garden. They thought I was upstairs. My father-in-law said, "Once Daniel's gone, we'll sell this place, split it, and finally pay off that loan." My chest tightened, not with fear, but with something colder. I almost walked out then, confronted them, shouted that I wasn't going anywhere. But I bit my tongue until it bled. Because I knew, when the confrontation finally came, it wouldn't be in my backyard. It would be under fluorescent lights, with a judge in front of us and their signatures piled on the desk. So I waited. I let them dream aloud. I let them paint my kitchen and change my locks. I let them imagine every dollar they'd invested was a chain around my ankles. And quietly, I hired a lawyer. We met in a small office downtown. She listened carefully, flipping through my folders one by one. Each page she turned, her eyebrows rose higher. When she finally closed the last folder, she leaned back and said, "Daniel, this is airtight. They think they're setting you up. But what they're really doing is setting themselves up for one of the cleanest deed transfers I've ever seen." I nodded. My throat was tight, but not with nerves. With certainty. The months rolled on. Thanksgiving came. My in-laws carved turkey at my table, laughed too loudly, clinked glasses as though they already owned the dining room. I raised my glass too and silently toasted the storm they couldn't see coming. By Christmas, the house gleamed like new. My wife's parents walked through it like royalty, bragging about the investments they'd made. They had no idea every receipt they proudly kept was another nail in their coffin. Sometimes, in quiet moments, doubt crept in. I'd ask myself, am I really going to strip them bare? They're family. But then I'd remember the way they looked at me, not as Daniel, not as husband or father or man, just as an obstacle between them and $750,000. Family doesn't strip family like that. So no, I told myself, they weren't family anymore. They were thieves in nicer clothes. The day I decided to move, truly move, came in spring. My lawyer called. "Daniel, if you're ready, we can file the petition. With everything you've collected, we'll flip the deed in court. They'll never see it coming." I hung up and looked around my house, the house they'd poured money into, the house they bragged about to friends, the house they thought was their future. It was time. When spring arrived, the house looked like a showpiece. The siding was clean enough to catch the sun like polished stone, the bathrooms sparkled with new tiles, and the hardwood floors gleamed with the smell of fresh lacquer. Every improvement screamed wealth, but to me, it whispered something else: bait. My in-laws paraded through the house as though they were hosts at a grand estate. They'd bring friends over, just to stop by, and then proudly gesture toward the new kitchen island. "Solid quartz," my father-in-law would brag. "Custom cabinets. Worth every penny." Every penny of theirs, not mine. And every time he bragged, I wrote down the date, the words, and the witnesses. Documentation wasn't just paperwork anymore. It became ritual, almost holy. One Saturday afternoon, I stood by the doorway, listening as he ran his palm across the banister and told his wife, "You know, once this place is properly in our hands, we can refinance and cover the rest of our debts." Finally, breathe easy. The audacity nearly made me laugh. My house had become their fantasy escape plan. They didn't even lower their voices anymore. Later that night, I told my wife what I'd heard. She sighed, sat on the edge of our bed, and pressed her hands together. "They're just dreaming," she said softly. "They're not really going to try to take the house. They're just proud of helping." "Helping?" I repeated. "Is that what you call it when someone measures your living room like a realtor and whispers about refinancing your mortgage behind your back?" Her eyes flickered with doubt. I could see the conflict tearing at her, between the loyalty of a daughter and the suspicion that her husband wasn't imagining things. She didn't answer. She just pulled the blanket over her lap and stared at the floor. I didn't press her. She'd see it soon enough. The following weeks brought more gifts. A new garage door, landscaping in the front yard. My mother-in-law even ordered custom drapes for the dining room. She walked in with a roll of fabric and declared, "This will make the house look truly elegant. Buyers will love it someday." Buyers. Not Daniel, not family. Buyers. I smiled politely as she measured the windows, but inside I felt my blood simmer. I wanted to shout, to tear the fabric in half, to throw them both out of my house. But patience whispered louder. "Not yet. Let them keep digging." And dig they did. By midsummer, they had poured nearly $60,000 into renovations. To them, it was an investment. To me, it was evidence stacked high, a tower of arrogance waiting to collapse. Still, living under the same roof with their constant presence was suffocating. I'd find my father-in-law in the basement, inspecting the furnace. "Old unit," he'd mutter. "When we replace it, this property's value will skyrocket." I'd find my mother-in-law in the pantry, shifting jars and boxes around, as if already reorganizing it for her tastes. They moved through the house like ghosts rehearsing for their afterlife. Except they weren't haunting me. They were haunting themselves, not realizing every word, every action was already shaping the story that would crush them. One evening I sat alone in the renovated living room, the smell of new wood still sharp in the air. I imagined them standing in front of a judge, trying to explain why they poured money into a house they didn't own, why they boasted about our property in front of witnesses, why every receipt bore their signature and not mine. The vision was so vivid I almost smiled. But revenge, real revenge, isn't just about preparation, it's about timing, so I waited. And then came the dinner. It was early autumn, leaves scattering across the porch. My in-laws invited themselves over, bringing a bottle of wine and a folder of papers. We sat at the table, me, my wife, her parents. They poured glasses, clinked them, and then slid the folder toward me. Inside were renovation receipts, neatly organized, each with a sticky note labeling what it was worth now. Kitchen, $28,000. Floors, $12,500. Garage, $6,800. Total, nearly $70,000. My father-in-law cleared his throat. Daniel, you see, we've done a lot for this house. A lot. It's only fair we discuss arrangements. Arrangements? I asked, though my voice stayed calm. Yes, he said. When the time comes, and it will, we expect this house to be handled fairly, split properly. It would be a shame for all this investment to just vanish. I leaned back in my chair, studying them. My wife shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between us. My mother-in-law sipped her wine, her hand trembling slightly, but her eyes held mine with steely determination. They thought they had me cornered. But I had been waiting for this. I closed the folder slowly, almost reverently, as though it contained a holy text. Then I slid it back across the table. Don't worry, I said evenly. Every penny will be accounted for, I promise. They smiled, mistaking my words for surrender. What they didn't realize was that I had already taken that folder's twin to my lawyer, already drafted the papers, already prepared the motion. And when the time came, I would keep my promise. Every penny would be accounted for, just not the way they expected. A week after that dinner, things escalated. My father-in-law started dropping by without calling first. I'd come home from the hardware store and find his car in the driveway, his shoes on my welcome mat. Once, I walked into the living room and found him with a tape measure, stretching it across the wall. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He barely looked up. "Just checking dimensions. If you ever want to knock down this wall and open the space, you'll need to know." I wanted to snatch the tape out of his hand and throw it across the room. Instead, I just nodded slowly, memorizing the date, the time, and the smug curl of his mouth when he said, "You'll need to know." The arrogance grew. My mother-in-law began to act like the lady of the house. She rearranged my bookshelves without asking, replaced my bathroom towels with ones she bought, and one afternoon I caught her going through my mail. She waved it off with a smile, just checking to see if anything important came. They didn't even pretend anymore. In their minds, the house was already theirs, and I was just the placeholder. But placeholders don't keep folders as thick as mine. Every incident went into the record. My lawyer started calling it the inheritance of arrogance. She told me, "Keep writing everything down, Daniel. Don't interrupt them. The more they believe you're passive, the harder they'll crash when the hammer drops." I followed her advice. One evening, while I sat in my study, I overheard my father-in-law talking to my wife in the kitchen. His voice was low, but I caught every word. "You and Daniel should think about drawing up papers. Joint ownership, to protect the investment we've made." My wife hesitated, then mumbled something I couldn't make out. My hands clenched into fists. Joint ownership. That was his next step. He thought he could pressure her into pushing me. That night, I sat her down. "Do you see now?" I asked. "This isn't about generosity. It's about control. They don't want to help. They want to own." Her face crumpled. Tears welled in her eyes. For the first time, she nodded. I thought they were just trying to be kind. But they've been talking to me like it's already theirs. "I'm sorry, Daniel." Her apology was genuine, but it didn't heal the wound. The betrayal wasn't hers. It was theirs. And soon they would feel what betrayal really costs. Winter arrived, and with it, one more renovation. They insisted on upgrading the heating system, a brand new furnace installed at their expense. My father-in-law bragged to the neighbors, "We spared no cost. When this house sells, it'll be top of the market." The neighbors started whispering too. I'd hear them when I walked to get the mail. "Strange arrangement," Mrs. Green said to another woman. "Daniel's in-laws spending all that money on his place. Makes you wonder who's really in charge." I smiled faintly when I heard that, because soon the entire neighborhood would know exactly who was in charge, and it wouldn't be them. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. My lawyer called one crisp January morning. "Daniel, it's time. We have enough. Their words, their money, their arrogance. It's all documented. We'll file for deed correction. Let them explain to a judge why they've been pouring money into property they don't own. Judges love paper trails, and you've got a mountain." I hung up and stared out the frosted window. The house gleamed in the cold sunlight, every inch of it a testament to their vanity. I thought of the new roof, the polished floors, the shining kitchen, and I smiled. Because soon, all of it would be legally mine, locked, sealed, untouchable. But more than that, soon the silence would break. The quiet contempt they'd shown me would echo back at them in the only place they couldn't ignore, court. And I'd be there to watch every word they'd ever bragged about crumble under oath. The weeks after my lawyer's call were some of the longest of my life, not because I doubted the outcome, but because of how boldly my in-laws kept pressing forward, unaware that the ground beneath them had already turned to quicksand. Every evening they would show up at the house with another idea. A new fence, they said, would improve curb appeal. Solar panels would increase energy efficiency and resale value. My father-in-law even brought brochures, laying them on my dining table like blueprints for a future I hadn't agreed to. I played the role of the tired homeowner, nodding politely, sipping my coffee, and letting them dream out loud. But the moment they left, I wrote everything down, my notebooks filled with quotes, dates, and gestures. I described the way his finger traced across the countertop, as though pricing it in his head. I wrote about the smirk when he told my wife, "You'll thank us later." Those notebooks weren't just memory aids anymore. They were weapons being sharpened one page at a time. At night, I would sit in the kitchen alone, flipping through them while the house was quiet. The silence was no longer suffocating. It was alive, pulsing, reminding me to stay patient. Every page was a reminder that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't paranoid. I had proof, and proof doesn't lie. One evening, after another unsolicited inspection, I caught my father-in-law lingering in the garage. I stepped outside and found him looking up at the beams, muttering under his breath. "What are you doing?" I asked. He looked at me without flinching. "Just thinking about how much value a finished garage adds. You leave it like this, Daniel. You're throwing away 50 grand. I tilted my head. Throwing it away, or leaving it for you to collect? For the first time, his expression slipped, just for a second. Then he forced a laugh and clapped me on the shoulder. "We're all family. Same thing in the end, right?" I smiled. "Right." But inside I marked it down in bold. He admitted it. Same thing in the end. The arrogance of people who believe they've already won is almost beautiful. They become careless, sloppy, unable to hide the hunger in their eyes. My in-laws didn't realize their hunger was the very thing feeding my case. My lawyer, Amanda, was methodical. She had me bring the folders again, this time spreading them across her office table like a crime board. She tapped her pen against one of the receipts. "Look at this language," she said. "Payment for kitchen remodel, authorized by John and Patricia, no mention of you, no request from you." Legally, this doesn't make them owners. It makes them investors who assumed risk. And investors don't get ownership just because they spent money. They need contracts. They don't have contracts. They have arrogance. She leaned back, folded her arms, and smirked. Judges hate arrogance. Her confidence was a balm. I walked out of her office with my folders under my arm and a lightness in my step. But the real test wasn't in her office. It was in my home, every day, enduring their constant needling. One Sunday they hosted themselves in my living room, inviting over friends from their church group. I sat in my chair, listening as they gave a tour of my house, speaking like realtors showing off a property. "This fireplace alone adds 20 grand, my father-in-law boasted, and the hardwood, custom installed, worth every penny we spent." They didn't even acknowledge me sitting there. One of the guests gave me a curious glance, as if silently asking, "Why are you letting this happen?" I smiled faintly and sipped my coffee, because letting it happen was the point. Let them dig their graves deeper with every word. After the guests left, I walked through the house slowly, touching the walls, the floors, the fixtures. Each one gleamed with their money, and each one whispered back to me, "Not theirs, yours." My wife struggled more with every passing week. Her parents pressed her constantly, asking her to talk to me about joint agreements. She grew weary of the conflict, caught between loyalty and clarity. One night she broke down at the kitchen table. "Daniel, I can't keep hearing it from both sides. They're my parents. You're my husband. I don't know who to believe anymore." I leaned forward, gently taking her hands. "Believe what you see, not what you're told. Who owns the deed? Who paid the mortgage for 20 years? Who has every receipt showing they acted without permission? It's not about love, it's about truth. And the truth is, they're trying to steal from us. Not help us, steal from us." Her tears fell silently and she nodded. "You're right. I just wish it wasn't true." Truth doesn't ask if you wish for it. It just stands there, unyielding. By February, Amanda had everything ready. "We'll petition for a declaratory judgment," she explained. "It'll state plainly, you are the sole owner. Their expenditures don't entitle them to equity. In fact, it strengthens your position, because judges view this as unilateral improvements. Essentially, gifts." "Gifts?" I repeated, almost laughing. "Yes," she said, smiling. "And courts don't reward people for giving gifts with one hand while plotting theft with the other." Hearing it framed that way was delicious. Every smug look, every backhanded comment, every so-called investment, all reduced to unwanted presents I could toss aside with the stroke of a pen. Meanwhile, my in-laws carried on with their fantasies. They invited my wife to lunch one afternoon and told her, "When the time comes, you'll be glad we made all these decisions for you. You'll inherit a perfect home, ready to sell." She came home pale, shaken, repeating their words. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders and whispered, "They think the time is coming for me, but it's coming for them." I wasn't wrong. The petition was filed quietly, just like everything else I had done. No grand announcement, no arguments across the table, no confrontation in my kitchen. One morning, while frost clung to the windows, I simply drove downtown, signed my name in front of a clerk, and handed over a folder that had taken a year of patience to build. As I left the courthouse, the cold air stung my face. I stood there for a moment, looking up at the gray sky, and felt something shift inside me. It wasn't triumph yet. It was steadiness. The kind of steadiness that comes when you know the train is already barreling down the tracks and nothing can stop it. My in-laws didn't know the papers were filed. They carried on as though the house was already theirs. That week, my father-in-law showed up with a contractor, walking him through the backyard, pointing out where he wanted to extend the patio. "Imagine a stone terrace out here," he said proudly. "Perfect for entertaining, adds serious value." The contractor nodded, scribbling notes. I stood on the porch, watching. "Who's paying for this?" I asked. "Don't worry about it," he said with a dismissive wave. "It'll all work out in the end." I smiled faintly. He had no idea how much it really would work out. That evening, I added the contractor's card and a note about the conversation into my folder, another page in the growing book of their undoing. At dinner, my wife barely touched her food. She glanced at me, then at her parents. Finally, she spoke up. "Maybe we should slow down on renovations. It feels like too much." Her father looked at her sharply. "Too much? There's no such thing as too much improvement. Don't you want to live in a house that's worth something?" Her voice trembled. "It's already worth something. It's our home." For a moment, silence hung in the air. My mother-in-law's fork clinked against her plate. Then her husband laughed, a low chuckle. "Sentimental nonsense. Homes aren't about feelings, they're about value." I caught my wife's eye. In that moment, she saw it as clearly as I did. This wasn't family helping us. This was predators circling. Later that night, in our bedroom, she whispered, "You're right. They don't see us. They see numbers." I don't know how I ignored it for so long. I pulled her close. "Don't blame yourself. They're your parents. Of course you wanted to believe the best. But now you see the truth. And soon, so will everyone else." The following week, Amanda called me into her office. She had a spread of documents across her desk. Neat stacks of receipts, notarized statements, copies of text messages, even affidavits from 2 neighbors who had overheard my in-laws boasting about our property. She tapped the stack with her pen. "Daniel, this isn't just strong. This is iron. They've tied their own noose. Judges love when people hang themselves with their own words." "Do you think they'll fight it?" I asked. "Oh, they'll fight. But arrogance blinds people. They'll walk into court convinced they're right, and every time they open their mouths, they'll dig deeper. Trust me, you'll barely have to speak." The thought made me almost giddy. After months of biting my tongue, of swallowing my anger, the idea that their own pride would be their downfall, it was poetic. That night, I walked through the house slowly, room by room. I touched the cool quartz of the kitchen counters, the polished wood of the banister, the tiles in the bathroom. I whispered to myself, "All gifts. Every bit of it. Gifts I never asked for. Gifts they can't take back." For the first time in months, I slept soundly. But the peace didn't last. Word had spread in the neighborhood. Mrs. Green, who lived 2 doors down, stopped me by the mailbox. "Daniel," she said cautiously, "people are talking. Your in-laws have been telling everyone that the house will be theirs soon. They say you're too tired to manage it anymore." Her words stung, not because they were true, but because they weren't. I clenched my jaw, forcing a calm smile. "Let them talk," I said. Sometimes the truth takes longer to travel, but when it arrives, it's louder than any rumor. She studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I believe you. And when the truth comes out, I hope I'm in the front row to see it." Her faith warmed me, but it also made me realize just how far my in-laws had gone. They weren't just plotting in private. They were rewriting the story of my life in public, casting me as the tired, incompetent man who couldn't hold on to his own house. I burned with quiet rage. But rage is only useful when it's contained, sharpened, directed. So I wrote it down. Every rumor, every boast, every neighbor's remark. The notebook swelled, a record not just of events, but of the slow, steady theft of my dignity. March arrived with a chill, and with it, a confrontation I'll never forget. My in-laws showed up unannounced, their faces flushed with purpose. My father-in-law slammed a stack of papers on my dining table. "What's this?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "Joint ownership agreement," he said firmly. "You and Patricia." He nodded at my wife. "Sign this, and everything's official. We've poured too much into this house to be left out. This makes it right." I flipped through the pages slowly. Legal jargon, poorly written. Probably something they pulled from the internet. It declared that they had equitable interest in my property and demanded their names be added to the deed. I looked up at them, my face unreadable. "And if I don't sign?" My mother-in-law leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Then we'll make sure everyone knows how ungrateful you are. How you let us spend our money and gave us nothing in return. Do you want to be the man who stole from his own family?" The irony almost made me laugh out loud. The man who stole from his own family? They had no idea how perfectly that line would play back in court. I closed the papers and slid them back. "I'll think about it," I said softly. They mistook my calm for hesitation. They walked out that night believing they had me cornered. But the next morning, I walked into Amanda's office, dropped the stack of papers on her desk, and said, "Add this to the pile." She leafed through them, her eyes widening in disbelief. "They actually gave you this? Daniel, they just gift-wrapped your victory. No judge will see this as anything but a blatant attempt to seize what isn't theirs." For the first time, I allowed myself to laugh. It was short, sharp, almost bitter, but it felt good. Weeks blurred into each other as the court date approached. My wife grew quieter, withdrawn, caught between love for her parents and the reality of what they'd done. Some nights, I found her crying in the bathroom. I never told her to choose. I just held her when she let me, and when she pulled away, I let her. One night she whispered, "They're going to hate me for standing with you." I cupped her face in my hands. "They already hate me for not bowing. But when this is over, you'll see they'll hate themselves more than either of us, because they'll realize they lost not because of me, but because of their own greed." As the court date loomed closer, I noticed a shift in my in-laws. They became more confident, louder, almost giddy. They bragged openly about our home, even hinting to friends that they were preparing to sell soon. Every boast was another nail in their coffin. And I was holding the hammer. The courthouse was smaller than I expected. For months, I'd pictured marble pillars, echoing chambers, a place where justice towered over everyone. Instead, it was a modest brick building with worn steps and a metal detector that beeped every third person through. But as I stood there, clutching my folder, it felt like the weight of 20 years of labor was in my hands. Amanda walked beside me, her heels clicking steadily. She looked calm, almost bored, like this was just another day at work. I envied that calm. My chest felt tight, my throat dry, but I also felt something else, buzzing just beneath the nerves. Anticipation. Inside, the waiting area buzzed with murmurs. My in-laws sat across the room. My father-in-law wore a navy blazer, a size too small, the buttons straining. My mother-in-law had pearls around her neck, her lips pursed in smug superiority. They didn't glance at me. They whispered to each other, chuckling, as if they were attending a play they'd already seen the ending of. I watched them, memorizing every detail, the way his knee bounced with restless energy, the way she tapped her nails against the armrest. They were confident, certain. Amanda leaned toward me. "Notice how relaxed they look? That's good. People who are too confident talk too much on the stand. Let them." When our case was called, we stepped into a room that smelled faintly of old books and dust. The judge sat behind a high desk, glasses perched low on his nose. He glanced at the file in front of him, then at us. Petitioner Daniel Whitmore. Respondents John and Patricia Ellis. He read aloud, "Let's proceed." Amanda began. She laid out the timeline calmly, methodically. She spoke of ownership, mortgage payments, deed records, all in my name, my signature, my history. Then she slid the folders forward. "And here, Your Honor, is the most telling evidence. Receipts, invoices, and correspondence all paid for and authorized solely by the respondents. At no point did Mr. Whitmore request or authorize these renovations. They acted unilaterally, under the assumption it would entitle them to ownership." The judge flipped through the stack, his eyebrows twitching occasionally. Then, John, my father-in-law, couldn't resist. He stood abruptly. "Your Honor, that house wouldn't even be standing if not for us. We paid for everything. New kitchen, new floors, new heating system. That place is worth twice what it was because of us." The judge raised a hand. "You'll have your turn. Sit." But John didn't sit. He jabbed a finger in my direction. "He's ungrateful. We invested over $70,000. That house should be ours as much as his." I stayed silent. Amanda only smiled faintly, like a teacher watching a student walk into a trap. Patricia joined in. "We've lived in that house more than he has. We've hosted friends, improved every room. Everyone knows it's practically ours." The judge tapped his pen on the desk. "Practically is not legally. Did you have a written agreement with Mr. Whitmore? A signed contract?" Their silence was deafening. John's face flushed red. "We didn't need one. We're family." "Family," the judge repeated, unimpressed. He scribbled a note, then gestured for Amanda to continue. Piece by piece, she dismantled them. She presented text messages where they bragged about our investment, neighbors, statements about their boasts, and even the so-called joint ownership agreement they had shoved at me. When that paper slid across the judge's desk, he actually chuckled. "This is not a contract. This is a demand." I glanced at John and Patricia. Their smugness had cracked, just slightly. His jaw tightened. Her hands fidgeted in her lap. Amanda ended with one final blow. "Your Honor, not only should Mr. Whitmore's sole ownership be reaffirmed, but given the respondents' actions, we request that any further claims they attempt to bring be barred as frivolous." The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. "I'll review everything and deliver a ruling." We left the courtroom, the tension humming between us. In the hallway, John sneered at me. "You think you've won? This isn't over. We'll appeal. We'll take everything in the end." I met his gaze, steady, funny. "That's exactly what I've been thinking, except in my version, it's already over." His face twisted, but before he could respond, Amanda ushered me forward. "Let him stew. He doesn't realize the hammer's already fallen." That night, I sat in my living room, the same living room they had paraded their friends through, bragging about their investment. The house was quiet, shadows stretching long across the polished floor. I thought of my mother-in-law's words. Homes aren't about feelings. They're about value. I ran my hand across the banister, smooth and solid beneath my palm. To me, it had never been about value. It was about history. My history. Every nail, every shingle, every hour of overtime that paid for it. And soon, it would be more than just history. It would be justice. Because Amanda had been right. Arrogance blinds people. And in that courtroom, they had blinded themselves so thoroughly that they hadn't even seen the cliff's edge until they were already falling. But the real drop, the real twist, was still coming. The day of the ruling arrived like a storm on the horizon. For weeks, I had replayed the courtroom scene in my head. Amanda presenting calmly, my in-laws unraveling, but nothing compared to the weight of walking up those courthouse steps, knowing today the silence would end. Inside, the benches creaked under the weight of whispered anticipation. A few neighbors had come, drawn by curiosity. Mrs. Green sat near the back, her arms folded, her sharp eyes flicking between me and my in-laws. John and Patricia sat at the respondents' table, smug as ever. John leaned back in his chair, one arm draped over the backrest, as if he were already king of the castle. Patricia adjusted her pearls and smirked in my direction. To them, this was formality. They believed the law would see fairness their way. The judge entered, robes flowing, gavel striking once. The room fell silent. He shuffled through the papers, his glasses low on his nose. Then he began. "I've reviewed the evidence presented. This case revolves around the ownership of the property located at 214 Willow Lane. Mr. Whitmore is the deeded owner of record. The respondents, John and Patricia Ellis, claim an equitable interest due to financial expenditures on renovations." He paused, adjusting his glasses. The room seemed to hold its breath. My heart hammered, but I kept my face calm. Amanda gave me a quick nod, her expression unreadable but steady. The judge continued. "First, on the matter of ownership, title records are clear. The sole deed holder is Mr. Whitmore. At no point was ownership transferred, nor was any joint tenancy established. On this point, there is no ambiguity." John shifted in his seat, his confident grin faltering just slightly. Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. "Second," the judge said, flipping to another page, "the respondents claim financial contribution entitles them to interest. However, the law is explicit. Unilateral improvements made without contract or agreement constitute gifts. Courts do not retroactively create ownership rights where none were agreed upon." A murmur rippled through the room. John shot up from his chair. "Gifts? We spent $70,000. That's not a gift, it's an investment." The judge's gaze snapped to him, cold and stern. "Sir, sit down. You will not interrupt this court again." John's face flushed crimson, but he sat, his fists clenching on the table. The judge read on. "The so-called joint ownership agreement presented by the respondents is, in fact, not a legal document. It bears no notary, no consideration, and is essentially a demand letter without force. Furthermore, the respondent's own statements, provided by witnesses, indicate intent to seize ownership through pressure rather than lawful transfer. Patricia's face drained of color. She gripped the edge of the table as though holding on for balance. The judge set the papers down. Therefore, the court reaffirms that sole ownership of the property remains with Mr. Whitmore. Additionally, due to the frivolous nature of these claims and the respondents' repeated attempts to exert unlawful pressure, this court orders that the respondents are barred from filing further claims against this property. Court costs are to be borne by the respondents. The gavel struck once. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the room erupted in whispers. I sat frozen, the words sinking in like warm sunlight after a long winter. Mine. The house was mine, indisputably, forever. Their money? Gifts. Their boasts? Evidence of their downfall. Amanda leaned close, whispering, "Congratulations. You didn't just win. You buried them." Across the room, John's face twisted with fury. He slammed his hand on the table. "This isn't justice! This is theft! Will—" The judge's gavel cracked again. "Enough. Bailiff, escort them out if necessary." Patricia's hands trembled as she gathered her purse. Her eyes darted around the room, catching on neighbors watching, whispering. The shame painted her cheeks red. As they shuffled toward the door, John turned and hissed at me. "You think you've won? You'll regret this." I stood slowly, my voice calm but steady. "The only thing I regret is letting you walk through my door in the first place." Gasps echoed. Mrs. Green actually smiled. The bailiff nudged them forward, and they disappeared into the hallway. I exhaled, the weight of years lifting all at once. For months I had endured their arrogance, their boasts, their slow theft of my dignity. And now, in one ruling, it was restored. As I walked out of the courtroom, Amanda at my side, the whispers followed. Not whispers of doubt anymore, but of vindication, of justice. Outside, the air was sharp and cool. The courthouse doors shut behind me, sealing the chapter. I looked up at the sky and let the silence wash over me. Not the silence of being stolen from, but the silence of victory. But the best part wasn't even the deed, or the court's order, or the fact that they had to pay court costs. The best part was knowing this story wouldn't stay hidden. Everyone they bragged to, everyone they'd whispered to about our home, would now hear the truth, that their money bought them nothing but humiliation. After the ruling, the courthouse emptied in slow ripples of murmurs. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered the words gifts and barred from filing, like gossip, too juicy to hold in. I walked out with Amanda, my folder tucked under my arm, but for the first time in a year, the folder felt light. Outside, Mrs. Green caught up with me. She put a hand on my shoulder, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "I knew they were full of themselves," she said. "But watching the judge call all that money, gifts, that was better than television." I chuckled softly. "They thought $70,000 bought them a house. Turns out it bought me witnesses." Word spread fast. By the next morning, neighbors were whispering over hedges. Clerks at the grocery store glanced at me knowingly, and even the cashier at the gas station said, "Heard you taught your in-laws a lesson." But the most satisfying part wasn't the whispers. It was the silence from John and Patricia. For months they had been loud, boasting, bragging, parading their imaginary ownership. And now, after the judge's words, they disappeared. No visits, no calls, just silence. That silence was sweeter than any cheer. At home, I walked through each room slowly, touching the countertops, the polished banister, the bathroom tiles. Every improvement glowed under the light, whispering the same truth. All gifts. I stood in the kitchen, remembering the day my father-in-law smirked. "You'll thank us later." I whispered into the empty room, "Thank you, not for the house, for the evidence." My wife was quieter than usual. She spent hours in the bedroom, her face pale. One night, she finally spoke. "They won't forgive me for siding with you." I sat beside her. They didn't lose because of you. They lost because of themselves. Don't carry their shame. Let them carry it alone. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. I held her, feeling both the weight of her grief and the lightness of my vindication. Days turned into weeks, and the aftershocks spread. John's friends stopped inviting him to poker nights. Patricia's bridge group dwindled. One neighbor told me she overheard someone say, "I wouldn't trust them to water my plants, let alone touch my house." Reputation is a fragile thing, and theirs had shattered like glass underfoot. Amanda called me one afternoon. The court finalized costs. They owe fees, filing, administrative, and part of your attorney expenses. How much? I asked. Just over $9,000. I nearly laughed. $70,000 in renovations, gone. $9,000 in court costs, owed. And the house, priceless, mine. The irony was too delicious. They had tried to buy ownership with money. Instead, money had bought their humiliation. One evening, as the sun set orange over the rooftops, I sat on the porch with a glass of bourbon. Mrs. Green passed by with her dog. She stopped, leaned on the fence, and smirked. "So, Daniel, how does it feel to be the king of the castle?" I lifted my glass. "Feels like I just got $70,000 of free renovations and a front row seat to justice." She laughed so loudly the dog barked. Inside, I found my wife sitting at the dining table, staring at the drapes her mother had picked. "Should we take them down?" she asked softly. I looked at the fabric, heavy and elegant. "No," I said. "Leave them. Let them hang here as a reminder. Every stitch is a warning. Greed has a price." Nights grew quiet. The house finally felt like mine again, not haunted by their footsteps or their boasts. Sometimes, in the silence, I almost heard their voices. Joint ownership, investment, value. But the echoes didn't sting anymore. They made me smile. Because the silence wasn't mine to carry now. It was theirs. Months later, a letter arrived from Amanda. It contained the certified copy of the deed, embossed with a seal, reaffirming me as the sole owner. I framed it, hung it in my study above the desk, where I had written down every note, every date, every arrogant word. The notebook sat beneath the frame, thick and worn, pages filled with their downfall. I didn't need to open it anymore. Just seeing the cover reminded me of the power of patience. Sometimes, revenge isn't fire, it isn't rage, it's silence, sharpened into a blade. And when you strike with it, the cut is clean, deep, unforgettable. I leaned back in my chair that night, looking at the framed deed, the quiet house around me, the shadows stretching across polished floors. They had tried to steal my future with whispers and arrogance. In the end, they gave me more than I ever imagined. Proof, power, and $70,000 of improvements they could never take back. The silence they left behind was louder than any scream. The weeks after the ruling stretched into a season of small victories. At first, it was the quiet, days without the sudden slam of my father-in-law's car door in the driveway, without my mother-in-law's footsteps echoing in the hallway. The house breathed again, like a chest finally freed from a tight band. Neighbors stopped by, some openly, others casually, but all with curiosity in their eyes. Mrs. Green wasn't the only one who wanted to talk. The man across the street, Mr. Latham, waved one evening and said, "Heard the court, called all that work a gift. Best return I've ever seen on unwanted family." I laughed, a deep, genuine laugh. Best return I've ever seen, too. But the whispers didn't stop at the fence lines. My wife overheard friends at the grocery store talking about it, how her parents had been so sure, how they'd told everyone the house was practically theirs, how humiliating it must have been to hear a judge strip it all away in a single breath. John and Patricia didn't show their faces in the neighborhood for weeks. When they finally did, heads turned, conversations hushed. Pride had made them loud, but shame made them mute. I heard through the grapevine that John had been cut out of his poker group. No one wanted to sit at a table with a man who bragged about property he didn't own, only to be exposed in court. Patricia's bridge club dwindled. One woman even told my wife. She tried to host a game last week. Half the women didn't come. No one wants to touch that kind of embarrassment. And that was the real cost, not the $70,000 they lost, not the $9,000 in court fees, but the way their names now carried weight of ridicule. They wanted ownership of a house. Instead, they owned their own humiliation. At home, I began to reclaim spaces that had felt tainted. I repainted the garage, alone, each stroke of the roller a declaration, mine. I fixed a squeaky stair they had ignored. I replaced the drapes they had chosen, not out of necessity, but because I wanted to erase their fingerprints from my view. Late at night, I sat in the study under the framed deed. The embossed seal caught the lamplight, glowing like a medal. Beneath it, my old notebook lay closed, its pages filled with their downfall. Sometimes I opened it and flipped through the entries, dates, quotes, receipts. Each page was like a step in a long staircase I had climbed. At the top stood silence, sweet, unbroken silence. One evening my wife joined me. She touched the frame, her fingers trembling. "I didn't think it would end like this," she whispered. "How did you think it would end?" I asked gently. "I thought we'd lose the house, or you'd give in, or worse, I'd be forced to choose between you and them." Tears welled in her eyes. But instead, they destroyed themselves. And I can't even be angry at you for it, because you didn't lift a hand, you just waited. I reached for her hand. Sometimes patience is the sharpest weapon. Let someone swing hard enough and they'll fall on their own blade. Her tears fell, but she smiled faintly. For the first time, I saw the last thread of loyalty to her parents snap. She leaned against me, her voice soft. "I'm glad you didn't let them win." I kissed her forehead. "They never had a chance. Not really. They just didn't see it." The months rolled on. The house grew warmer, fuller, more ours than it had ever been. I planted a small garden in the backyard, something I had always wanted but never dared to, while John prowled around talking about property value. The first sprouts broke the soil in early summer, tiny green signs of life, untainted by arrogance. Sometimes I'd catch neighbors pausing by the fence, nodding at the fresh blooms. Their smiles carried a message, "You did it." And my in-laws? Their silence became its own story. I heard whispers that John had tried to sell his truck, that Patricia had pawned jewelry. Renovations had drained them, and court costs had bled them further. They had nothing to show for it but shame. One afternoon, Mrs. Green stopped by with a pie. She set it on my porch table and said, "Daniel, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you handled it with grace." Most men would have shouted, fought, slammed doors. You just stood still. And stillness won. I looked at the house behind me, the sun glinting off the new roof. "Stillness," I said softly, "is louder than rage when the time is right." That night, I sat in the living room, bourbon in hand, the quiet hum of the furnace filling the air. The same furnace John had installed, convinced it bought him ownership. Now it hummed for me. Every tile, every floorboard, every improvement sang the same refrain. Mine. And in that silence, I realized something. Revenge hadn't been the courtroom ruling, or the deed, or even the humiliation of my in-laws. Revenge was the life I lived afterward, peaceful, undisturbed, in the very place they tried to steal. They had stolen my dignity for months. I took it back. They tried to steal my future. I gave them silence instead. And that silence screamed louder than anything they had ever boasted. That night, as the house settled into silence, I stood in the doorway of the study. The framed deed hung above my desk, the embossed seal glowing faintly in the lamplight. Beneath it, the notebook still sat, its pages full of their downfall. I thought about every argument, every smug word, every whispered rumor that had cut me down for months. And then I thought about the ruling, about the gavel striking, about the words that turned $70,000 into nothing more than gifts. For the first time in a long time, I smiled without bitterness. This house wasn't just wood and brick. It was proof. Proof that greed blinds. Proof that silence can roar. Proof that when you stand your ground, the people who try to bury you end up digging their own graves. I walked through the house slowly, running my hand along the banister, across the counters, over the drapes. Each touch whispered the same word, mine. And in that moment, I understood something I never had before. Revenge isn't loud. It doesn't always come with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes, the sweetest revenge is the quiet that follows. The peace of knowing the people who tried to steal from you will spend the rest of their lives haunted by the fact that they lost everything, by their own hand. The silence they left behind was louder than any scream. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe and join Taste of Revenge family, and share your impressions of the story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on one of the boxes on the right. Thank you for watching to the end.